I prayed, I cried, I begged God to move. But heaven was silent. I thought God had forgotten me, until He took everything I was clinging to. That's when I finally heard Him. There comes a moment in every believer's life when silence feels heavier than suffering. You kneel down, you pour out your heart, and all you hear back is nothing. You wait for God to move, but nothing changes. The door stays shut, the healing doesn't come, the money runs out, and the people you trusted walk away. You start wondering, why won't God answer me? But what if His silence was never rejection? What if His stillness was preparation? You see, there are seasons when God doesn't answer you because He's about to reveal Himself in a way you've never known before. When I lost everything, I discovered something I couldn't have found in success, in comfort, or in control. I found the voice of God in the ruins of my own plans. This message will change how you see unanswered prayers forever. So don't move, don't scroll, and don't stop listening, because before this ends, you'll understand why God stayed silent, what He was doing behind that silence, and how that silence became your greatest breakthrough. There are moments when heaven seems sealed shut, when your prayers feel like echoes fading into the void, and you start wondering if God has packed up and moved away. You kneel, you cry, you whisper, you wait, and yet there is no response. The silence is so loud it begins to scream inside your soul. You replay your prayers again and again, asking yourself if you did something wrong, if you lost favor, if maybe God has turned His face away. But what if that silence wasn't abandonment at all? What if it was the hand of God still working, unseen and unspoken? You see, God's silence is not His absence. His stillness doesn't mean He's forgotten you. It often means He's closer than you realize, working in ways that your understanding cannot yet grasp. When God is silent, it's because He is training your spirit to listen in a deeper way. Most of us want answers in words, but God often answers through presence. He doesn't always give explanations. He gives encounters. And when the noise of the world quiets, when the comfort of easy faith is gone, that's when you begin to perceive the subtle movements of His hand. The silence is not punishment, it's a lesson in perception. Because if you can't hear Him in the silence, you won't trust Him in the storm. Many people mistake silence for distance, but spiritual maturity recognizes that silence is sometimes God's classroom. When you stop hearing Him speak, He's teaching you to rely on what He already said. His last word is still powerful even when no new word comes. You remember His promises, His faithfulness, His covenant, and you learn that His character doesn't change with your circumstances. He may not be speaking new instructions because He's waiting for you to obey the last one. Sometimes the silence is the space where obedience is proven. The truth is, God's silence often comes right before revelation. The teacher is always quiet during the test, not because he's left the room, but because He wants you to use what He already taught you. And if you stay still long enough in that silence, you'll feel Him near. Not in thunder, not in fire, but in the still, small whisper that speaks without words. The prophet Elijah found that out in the cave. He wanted a dramatic answer, but God didn't show up in the earthquake or the fire. He came in a whisper so soft that only a quieted heart could catch it. That's how God speaks when He's drawing you closer. The silence of God isn't empty, it's full of meaning. It's the divine pause before transformation. Sometimes He stops speaking because He wants to realign your attention from the answer to the answerer. When you start chasing His hand more than His heart, He steps back and lets the silence bring you home again. He knows that a season of silence can do what 1,000 sermons cannot. It purifies your motives, tests your faith, and refines your relationship with Him. You begin to learn that prayer is not about getting something. It's about becoming someone. There are seasons when the silence stretches long enough to break your pride. You'll start by demanding answers, but after enough nights of nothing, your voice softens into surrender. You'll stop asking, "Why aren't you answering me?" and begin to say, "God, even if you don't answer, I'll still trust you." That's when the silence shifts from being a prison to being a place of peace. Because once you stop demanding to hear Him your way, you start to feel Him His way. Sometimes God's silence is His way of protecting you. If He told you too much too soon, you might run ahead of His plan. There are instructions that only make sense after He's prepared your heart to carry them. So He withholds the answer, not because you're unworthy, but because you're not ready yet. Just like a parent who doesn't explain every detail to a child, God's silence shields you from knowledge that could overwhelm or misguide you. And while you're in that holding place, He's still moving pieces behind the scenes, arranging divine connections, aligning opportunities, setting the stage for what's coming next. In the silence, your faith either dies or deepens. Those who quit praying miss the transformation that happens when words run out but worship continues. When you stop getting the answers you want, you start learning how to love God for who He is, not just for what He does. That's the shift silence brings. You move from performance to presence, from demanding to depending. And when you reach that place, you realize the silence was never a wall. It was a womb. God was birthing something new in you. There's a kind of strength that only grows in silence. When you can't hear God, but you keep standing, keep believing, keep worshiping anyway, your roots go deep. Faith is not built in the noise of miracles. It's built in the quiet of trust. The times when you feel most forsaken are often the times when you are being most formed. God doesn't always shout to prove He's near. Sometimes He whispers just to see if you'll stay close enough to hear. You must understand that every season of silence has a purpose. Maybe He's silencing the noise of others so you can discern His voice. Maybe He's allowing distance so you'll stop leaning on people who can't carry your destiny. Maybe He's quiet because He's letting your heart hunger again. The silence becomes sacred when you stop fearing it. It's not the absence of His presence, it's the preparation for His presence. Think about it. Even Jesus experienced silence from the Father on the cross. "My God, why have you forsaken me?" He cried. But that silence wasn't absence, it was fulfillment. God was still working, still redeeming, still writing the greatest story ever told. If the Son of God faced divine silence before resurrection, why should you think your silence is the end? It's not the end. It's the middle of a miracle still being written. In the stillness, something inside you begins to awaken. You start realizing that faith is not measured by how much you hear, but by how long you trust. When you can't trace His hand, you learn to trust His heart. That's why some prayers go unanswered for a while. They're meant to grow your capacity to believe. You start valuing His presence more than His performance. You start loving the giver more than the gift. And you find out that what felt like silence was actually the sound of God tuning your heart to the rhythm of heaven. Because in every pause, there's a promise. And in every silence, there's a sound waiting to be revealed. God's silence is not His absence. It's His method of molding you into someone who no longer panics when heaven seems quiet, but instead rests, knowing that quietness is the language of trust. And the moment your heart learns to rest there, you realize that God was never gone. He was speaking all along, just not in the way you expected. There comes a point in life when everything you've been holding on to begins to slip through your fingers, and no matter how tightly you try to grasp it, it's gone. The people you trusted begin to walk away. The job you thought would last forever suddenly ends. The savings you built vanishes, and the plans you once had for your life start to crumble before your eyes. You look around and realize that everything that once gave you comfort, identity, or direction has been taken. It's in that emptiness that you finally start to see something you couldn't before. Because as long as we have something else to lean on, we don't lean on God fully. As long as we have distractions to depend on, we don't depend on the voice of the one who's been calling us all along. Sometimes God allows everything to fall apart, not to punish us, but to position us. He removes the noise, the attachments, the people, and the plans that keep us from hearing Him clearly. Losing everything doesn't destroy you. It clears the space where revelation can finally reach you. When you have too many things fighting for your attention, you can't discern the whisper of heaven. The heart that is full of self, of plans, of people's opinions, can't hear the delicate sound of divine direction. That's why sometimes God will strip away everything you thought was necessary until you realize that He alone is essential. It's not cruelty, it's clarity. He wants you to hear Him without interference. When you have options, you rely on strategy. When you have nothing, you rely on grace. and grace is where real power flows. In seasons of abundance, we tend to confuse comfort with calling. We start thinking that because things are going well, we must be right where God wants us. But often it's in the breaking that we find our true direction. The loss of something you depended on is usually the beginning of a deeper dependence on God. He doesn't compete with idols, He removes them. If something is standing between you and your ability to hear Him, He'll allow it to be shaken until you realize that what you lost was never your source. It was only your support. God is your source. And when everything else fails, that truth becomes alive. There's a strange mercy in loss. When you lose what you thought you couldn't live without, you discover what you truly need to live. The job may be gone, the relationship may be over, the dream may be delayed, but in the middle of that wreckage, something eternal begins to awaken inside you. You start praying differently. You stop performing prayers and start pouring your heart out. You stop rehearsing religious words and start having real conversations with God. It's amazing how clearly you can hear Him when your heart has nothing left to prove. Sometimes God waits until you are emptied of all distractions because He knows you can't truly recognize His voice while it's competing with 100 others. The loss becomes a form of divine isolation, a sacred separation from everything that dilutes your attention. In that loneliness you find focus. You begin to see that God didn't take things away from you to hurt you. He removed them so you could finally hear the truth that was buried beneath all the noise. That truth is that He was always enough. You just couldn't see it until everything else was gone. You'll notice how sharp your spiritual senses become when life strips you bare. When there's no one to turn to, no comfort to lean on, and no backup plan to depend on, suddenly your heart becomes tuned to heaven. You start catching small signs of His presence you used to overlook. The same sunrise you ignored before now looks like a personal message. The same scripture you've read 1,000 times suddenly feels alive. That's what happens when loss clears the fog. You begin to see the fingerprints of God in the smallest things. There's a reason why God allows some of us to go through seasons where everything falls apart. It's because He knows we're too strong in ourselves. We've built altars to our plans, our success, our relationships, and He loves us too much to let us keep worshiping those idols. So He shakes them, removes them, and lets the dust settle until all that's left is Him. You see, God doesn't compete for your attention, He consumes it. When you finally lose what distracted you, you find what defines you. Every person who has ever walked closely with God has gone through a season where they lost everything that made sense. Abraham had to leave his home. Joseph lost his freedom. Moses lost his position. Job lost his family and wealth. The disciples lost their security. And yet in that loss, every one of them found a level of revelation that changed history. That's not coincidence, it's divine pattern. The wilderness always precedes the promise. The loss always comes before the encounter. When you have nothing left, your prayers become purer. You no longer pray to impress, you pray to survive. You don't ask God to bless your plans, you ask Him to guide your steps. That's why the most powerful prayers come from the most broken places. There's a kind of honesty that can only be born from loss, and that honesty draws heaven closer than any polished sermon or ritual ever could. You start realizing that what you lost was never meant to last forever anyway. Some things were seasonal blessings that you tried to make permanent. God had to take them away so your hands would be free to receive what's eternal. He'll never take something without preparing something greater. But He won't reveal the greater until you stop clinging to the lesser. The space created by loss becomes the doorway through which new life enters. It's not easy to let go of what once made you feel secure. You'll have days where you question everything, where you sit in the quiet and wonder if you'll ever recover. But even in that pain, something holy is happening. You're being stripped of the illusion that you were ever in control. You're being invited into a deeper kind of faith, the kind that trusts God when you have nothing left to offer Him but your broken heart. When the noise of the world fades, when your circle grows smaller, when the things you once leaned on disappear, you'll notice something sacred. You're finally free to listen. And in that quiet, you'll start to hear Him speak, not through thunder, but through peace. Not through noise, but through stillness. He was never far. He was just waiting for you to be still enough to recognize His presence. That's the paradox of divine loss. What you thought was the end was actually the beginning. The moment you thought you were abandoned was the moment God was preparing you for intimacy. He let everything else fall so that only His voice would stand. Because when all else fails, when all else fades, and when all else leaves, the voice of God remains. And in that voice, you'll find the purpose behind every loss, and the strength to rebuild with heaven's blueprint, not your own. There is something about human nature that wants to fix everything on its own. We are wired to take control, to find solutions, to make things work by our own effort. We pray, but then we rush to help God out, as if He needs our strategy to complete His plan. We ask for His will, but we already have our own version of how that will should look. And then when things begin to fall apart, we don't understand why. We think maybe the prayer didn't work, or maybe God didn't hear. But in reality, He's waiting for something much deeper than our words. He's waiting for surrender. He's waiting for the moment when we stop trying to fix it ourselves. Because as long as you are still fighting in your own strength, you're telling God, I've got this. And God will not compete with your strength. He'll let you keep fighting until you realize that the battle was never yours to begin with. God waits until you've exhausted every plan, every connection, every backup option. He waits until you're standing in the middle of your own limitations, until you've tried everything and it still doesn't work. Not because He enjoys your struggle, but because He knows that until you stop striving, you won't let Him take over. It's in the breaking point, the moment where your strength gives out, that His power begins to flow. You'll never truly know what it means to trust God until you've been in a situation you can't fix. When your prayers shift from, God, do this, to God, have your way, you've moved from control to surrender, and that's where miracles begin. God's power doesn't manifest through self-reliance. It manifests through yielded hearts. He doesn't need your strategy, He needs your surrender. You see, when you're still trying to make things happen on your own, you're operating in your own strength. But the supernatural doesn't live in human strength. It lives in human weakness. God said, My strength is made perfect in weakness. That means the moment you stop trying to prove how capable you are, that's when heaven steps in to prove how powerful He is. As long as you're doing the work of the miracle, you'll never see the miracle worker at work. It's easy to say, I trust God, when you still have a plan B. But trust is tested when all your plans collapse and the only thing left to lean on is His word. When you've done all you can, prayed all you can, believed all you can, and nothing changes, that's when true faith begins. Because faith isn't believing God can do it. It's believing He will, even when He hasn't yet. The delay is not to discourage you, it's to develop you. It's God saying, I need to take you beyond your logic, beyond your timing, beyond your ability, so you can finally see that I am enough. There's a deep truth that most people only learn through pain. Your strength has to fail so that God's strength can prevail. If you never come to the end of yourself, you'll never experience the beginning of His power. You'll keep carrying burdens that were never meant to be yours. You'll keep fixing situations that only obedience could heal. And the more you hold on, the heavier it becomes until one day you break under the weight. And in that breaking, you finally let go. That's when heaven moves. God doesn't meet you at the height of your independence. He meets you at the depth of your surrender. Some people wonder why God allows frustration, delay, and loss to visit their lives. But those are often the instruments He uses to loosen your grip. You wouldn't let go if things were easy. You wouldn't surrender if everything was smooth. You'd still be clinging to your plan, to your comfort, to your own understanding. So He lets the plan crumble. He allows the path to become unclear. He takes away the sense of control until you finally lift your hands and say, God, I can't, but you can. That moment is not weakness, that's strength. Because the greatest strength is not in holding on, it's in letting go. Think about Peter in the storm. He stepped out of the boat in faith, but when he started sinking, he cried, Lord, save me. He didn't try to swim back to the boat. He didn't try to save himself. He simply reached out and Jesus lifted him. That's the power of surrender. When you stop trying to fix yourself, when you stop trying to swim in your own wisdom, God reaches out and does in seconds what you couldn't do in years. There's also a hidden pride in our constant effort to fix everything. We don't call it pride, we call it responsibility, perseverance, or strength. But deep down, it's pride. It's the belief that we can make things happen if we just try harder. But God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. That means grace flows in the direction of surrender, not self-sufficiency. When you humble yourself and admit, I can't do this without you, you open the door for grace to flood your life. And grace can do more in one moment than effort can do in a lifetime. Sometimes we even pray, but we're not really surrendering. We're negotiating. We tell God what we want and how we want it done. We present Him with our blueprint, expecting Him to sign off on it. But God's not a contractor who builds your plan. He's the architect who designs His. And until you stop giving Him instructions and start giving Him permission, He won't move. Surrender is when you say, not my will, but yours be done. That's not a weak prayer, that's the prayer that shakes heaven. That's the same prayer Jesus prayed in Gethsemane. And in that surrender, the will of God unfolded with resurrection power. When God waits to answer, He's not being cruel. He's being careful. He's waiting until your faith is ready to receive without trying to control. He's waiting until your heart can handle His plan without trying to edit it. You can't hold divine promises with hands full of human plans. So He lets you try, lets you struggle. And when you finally come to the end of yourself, that's when He begins. The silence, the waiting, the exhaustion, it's all part of the breaking process that births revelation. You'll notice that when people finally stop trying to fix everything and start trusting God fully, something changes. Not just around them, but inside them. Peace replaces panic. Worship replaces worry. Hope replaces hurry. You no longer feel the need to manipulate outcomes or rush timing. You just rest, knowing that the one who holds the universe also holds your situation. And that rest is not laziness, it's confidence in His sovereignty. So many of us are carrying weights we were never meant to carry. We pray for God to take control, but then we grab the steering wheel the moment He turns in a direction we don't understand. But faith doesn't mean understanding every step. It means trusting the one who leads. And trust is proven not when you agree with the direction, but when you follow even when you don't. When you stop resisting the process, you start experiencing the peace that only obedience can bring. In every story of faith, there comes a breaking point, a moment when the strength of man meets the silence of God. It's in that intersection that surrender is born. It's where Jacob wrestles and walks away limping but blessed. It's where Moses throws down his staff and God turns it into a serpent. It's where Hannah stops weeping and starts worshiping. It's where you stop striving and start yielding. God waits for that moment because He knows that until you give up control, you won't give Him room to move. The miracle isn't in your ability. It's in your surrender. God doesn't want to see how strong you are. He wants to show you how strong He is through your weakness. And the moment you let go of your need to fix, your need to control, your need to understand, that's the moment heaven's power begins to flow in ways you never imagined possible. Brokenness has a way of stripping away the illusions that strength builds. It takes everything you thought you knew about faith, comfort, and control, and lays it bare before you. When life breaks you, when everything you depended on collapses, you suddenly realize that all along your foundation was too shallow to carry the weight of your destiny. And yet, it's in that very breaking that God begins to reveal Himself more deeply. Because brokenness is not a curse. It's a doorway. It's the place where revelation begins. God cannot fill what is already full. He cannot pour new wine into old skins. Sometimes He allows life to break you so that He can pour something new inside you. He doesn't break you to destroy you. He breaks you to rebuild you into something greater than you were before. When you've been broken, you see the world differently. The pride that once blinded you fades. The arrogance that made you self-sufficient disappears. You stop trying to impress people and start longing for intimacy with God. Brokenness does what comfort never could. It softens your heart. It makes you sensitive to His voice again. In the breaking, You begin to see the hand of God shaping you like clay in the potter's hands. Every crack, every fracture, every scar becomes part of His design. You may not understand it while it's happening, but one day you'll look back and realize that the pain that shattered you was also the hand that saved you. There are revelations that only come through pain. You can study the Word, you can listen to sermons, but there are dimensions of God's character that are only revealed in the fire. You learn that He is close to the brokenhearted not by hearing it, but by living it. You learn that His grace is sufficient not when you feel strong, but when you can't even stand. Brokenness opens your spiritual eyes. When everything around you is gone, you start to see what was always there but hidden. The steady presence of a God who never left. His voice becomes clearer when the noise of your own ambition dies down. His love becomes tangible when you've got nothing left to offer in return. Most people run from brokenness because it hurts, but they don't realize that what hurts is not the breaking itself, it's the resistance to it. When you stop resisting, when you allow the process to do its work, something miraculous happens. You start to sense the presence of God right there in the ashes. You begin to understand that He doesn't wait for you to fix yourself before He meets you. He meets you in your brokenness and starts fixing you from the inside out. The most beautiful people are not those who have never been broken, but those who have learned to let their cracks become windows for God's light to shine through. Brokenness creates depth. It removes the surface level faith that depends on blessings and builds a deeper trust that depends on presence. You start worshiping not because everything is right, but because you know He's worthy even when everything is wrong. You stop chasing the feeling of faith and start walking by the reality of it. God allows breaking to separate what is shallow from what is genuine. It's in those moments that your prayers change. You stop asking for escape and start asking for endurance. You stop begging for deliverance and start craving revelation. You stop trying to run from the fire and begin to understand that sometimes the fire is where you find Him. Every story of divine transformation begins with breaking. Joseph was broken by betrayal before he ever sat on the throne. David was broken by guilt before he ever wrote songs that healed generations. Paul was broken by blindness before he ever saw truth. Even Jesus was broken on the cross before He was raised in glory. Brokenness always precedes revelation because you cannot carry heavenly insight with earthly pride. The breaking humbles you enough to handle what God wants to reveal. When everything is shattered, that's when you start to see how fragile your plans were and how steady His purpose remains. The things you thought were permanent, relationships, jobs, health, dreams, may fall apart, but what's unshakable stays. And when the dust settles, what remains is what's real. The breaking clears away what's temporary so that only the eternal stands. You realize that peace doesn't come from stability, it comes from surrender. Joy doesn't come from comfort, it comes from closeness to God. Hope doesn't come from results, it comes from revelation. In the quiet moments after the breaking, something sacred begins. You start talking to God differently. You stop trying to sound right and start being real. You cry without fear, you confess without shame, and you listen without hurry. In that raw vulnerability, you encounter His grace in ways you never knew were possible. You see that He never asked you to be perfect. He only asked you to be honest. Brokenness takes away your masks, your pretenses, your performance. It leaves you exposed, but in that exposure you find freedom. There's a beauty in brokenness that the world cannot understand. The world teaches you to hide your cracks, to pretend you're fine, to polish the pieces. But God looks for the cracks. He pours His presence into them. The Japanese have an art called kintsugi, where they repair broken pottery with gold, making the cracks the most beautiful part of the vessel. That's what God does with a broken heart. He doesn't hide your scars. He highlights them with grace so others can see His glory shining through them. The very thing you thought disqualified you becomes the thing He uses to minister to others. Sometimes God allows your heart to be broken so you can understand the hearts of others who are broken. You begin to feel compassion in a way you couldn't before. You speak softer, you love deeper, you forgive quicker. Brokenness expands your capacity to love because it teaches you what it feels like to need love the most. It makes you approachable, relatable, real. You become a vessel that can carry healing because you've been healed. There's also a divine rebuilding that begins after the breaking. God starts constructing something entirely new, something that couldn't have existed without the collapse of the old. The walls you once built for protection are replaced with windows of faith. The pride you once wore as armor becomes humility that invites others in. The independence that made you strong becomes dependence that makes you wise. He rebuilds you, not to restore what was, but to raise something far greater. The deeper the breaking, the greater the revelation. You start to see that God doesn't dwell in your comfort. He dwells in your surrender. He doesn't reveal himself in your perfection. He reveals himself in your pain. When everything is stripped away, he becomes your everything. You begin to understand scriptures that once felt distant. You realize that the Lord really is close to the brokenhearted because you can feel that closeness now. It's not theory anymore, it's reality. You realize that his grace is not just a phrase. It's breath, it's survival, it's life. Brokenness changes how you hear God. Before, you might have heard his voice in grand moments, in victories, in blessings. But after the breaking, you start hearing him in silence, in tears, in stillness. He whispers to your heart when you're too weak to lift your head. You find him not in the thunder, but in the whisper that says, "I'm still here." That whisper becomes your anchor, your comfort, your assurance. In brokenness, you start asking, "Why me?" And start asking, "What are you showing me?" The focus shifts from pain to purpose. You realize that the breaking wasn't random. It was refined by love. You begin to see how even your worst days were woven into a story of redemption. The same God who allowed the breaking is the same God who planned the rebuilding. And in that understanding, peace begins to rise where pain once ruled, and revelation begins to bloom where questions once grew. There are times when you look at your life and it feels like everything is on pause. You've prayed the same prayers, spoken the same declarations, believed with all your heart, and yet nothing seems to move. You watch others step into their breakthroughs, while you're still waiting in the same place. And you start to wonder if maybe you missed something. You start to question if God is even listening, if somehow your prayers got lost between heaven and earth. But what if the waiting wasn't a sign of neglect, but of design? What if what you call delay is actually divine timing at work? Because God's delays are never denials, they are divine designs. He's not holding something from you. He's holding it for you until you are ready to receive it without losing it. God's timing is not like ours. We measure time in hours and days. He measures it in preparation and purpose. What feels like a long season of nothing is often God aligning everything. There are things he's putting in place behind the scenes, people he's positioning, circumstances he's arranging, hearts he's softening, so that when the moment comes, everything fits perfectly. He doesn't rush what he's building because he's not making something temporary. He's crafting something eternal. If he answered too soon, it could damage you. If he moved too fast, it could overwhelm you. What feels like waiting is actually God protecting you from premature blessings that could destroy you. Sometimes we're not waiting on God, God is waiting on us. He's waiting for maturity, for surrender, for trust. He's waiting until your character can carry what your faith is asking for. A blessing given too early can feel like a burden. Imagine giving a child the keys to a car before they've learned how to drive. It would destroy them. That's why God withholds certain answers until the time is right. The promise is not in question, your readiness is. And while you're waiting, he's shaping you to become the kind of person who can handle the promise without losing your soul in the process. Every delay has a divine reason. Sometimes God delays because he wants to show you something about himself that you could only see through waiting. You learn patience, endurance, and faith that doesn't depend on speed. You discover that he's still good even when he's still silent. The delay becomes a classroom where your dependence is deepened. You stop serving him for what he can give and start serving him for who he is. That's the kind of faith that grows in the soil of waiting. When everything else has stopped moving, and yet your faith refuses to quit, you begin to walk at the rhythm of heaven. There are things that can only be built in delay. Strength is one of them. When God makes you wait, he's strengthening your spirit, fortifying your trust, deepening your roots. Quick answers don't build lasting faith. Waiting does. The waiting season teaches you how to worship without results, how to praise without proof, how to believe when nothing looks believable. Every prayer that goes unanswered on your timeline is producing something unseen inside you. The delay is doing more for your soul than the miracle ever could. Sometimes God delays because He's writing a bigger story than the one you're asking for. You see only your chapter, but He sees the whole book. He knows that what He's preparing in you will impact more than just you. It will touch others, inspire others, strengthen others. If He gave you what you wanted too soon, the story wouldn't have enough power to reach beyond you. So He takes His time. He paints the picture slowly. And when the time is right, He reveals a masterpiece that could only have been created through patience. Waiting is hard because it feels like inactivity, but waiting in God is not passive. It's powerful. It's the kind of waiting that molds you, not stalls you. Every day you don't see the answer. He's building something in you that can't be shaken. He's teaching you to listen, to discern, to walk by faith and not by sight. When you finally come into your promise, you'll realize that the waiting was not wasted. Every tear, every delay, every disappointment was preparing you for the moment you would step into destiny with wisdom, humility, and grace. Think about Joseph. He dreamed of greatness, but before he ever saw a throne, he saw a prison. 13 years passed between the promise and the fulfillment. To anyone looking from the outside, it looked like delay. But it wasn't delay, it was design. God was preparing his character, building his integrity, teaching him to trust even when life didn't make sense. When the time finally came, Joseph didn't just receive a position, he had become the kind of man who could handle it. The delay was the process that made him ready. There's also a divine rhythm to how God moves. We often want Him to act immediately, but He works in seasons. Just like a seed takes time to grow, your promise has a process. No matter how much you water or pray, the seed still has to go through stages. Burial, darkness, waiting, and then breakthrough. If you dig up the seed too soon, you'll ruin what was growing underground. Some of what you're calling unanswered prayer is actually unseen progress. God is growing something in silence, and the moment you're ready, what was hidden will rise. The delay is not meant to discourage you, but to deliver you from the addiction to instant results. In this generation, everything is fast food, fast success, fast recognition. But God doesn't move at the speed of convenience, He moves at the speed of purpose. His timing has eternal weight. If He's making you wait, it means the outcome is too important to be rushed. It means He's crafting something that will last beyond the moment. Waiting also reveals what's in your heart. It tests your motives. It shows whether you want the blessing or the blesser. Many people serve God for a season, expecting results on their schedule, but when nothing happens, they quit. But those who stay, those who wait, those who worship through silence, they find a depth of faith that can't be shaken. They discover that the waiting place is not empty, it's sacred. It's where God whispers, "I'm working even when you can't see me." You'll notice that when God finally answers, it always makes sense. You look back and realize why it had to take that long, why certain doors had to close, why certain people had to leave, why certain opportunities had to fall through. If any of those things had worked out before their time, you wouldn't have been where you needed to be when the real blessing arrived. That's the beauty of divine timing. It connects every delay, every disappointment, every detour into one perfect story. When you understand that God's delays are divine designs, you stop panicking in the waiting. You stop trying to force doors open that aren't meant to open yet. You stop comparing your timing to someone else's. You begin to rest, to trust, to find peace even in the pause. Because the same God who made the promise is the same God who controls the clock. He's not late. He's not absent. He's simply aligning things so that when the appointed time arrives, everything falls into place effortlessly. The wait may be long, the silence may be heavy, and the uncertainty may test every part of you. But what looks like nothing is actually everything in disguise. The hands of God are working in the background, crafting a timing so perfect that when it unfolds, you'll know it wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. What you call delay, heaven calls design. And one day, when it all comes together, you'll see that He never made you wait to punish you. He made you wait so you could be prepared for something greater than you asked for, stronger than you expected, and more beautiful than you imagined.